She didn't even see the first flash, only the way the night suddenly went white around the edges, like someone had ripped the sky open. 1 second Sandra was stepping off the curb, laughing at something Keanu had whispered, and the next, the street had turned into a wall of lenses and shouting voices. The premiere was supposed to be routine. They'd done this 100 times, smile, wave a few interviews, then vanish into the soft dark of the theater. But as their car door opened, the crowd outside felt wrong. The air was too tight, the noise too sharp. Paparazzi usually stayed behind the barriers. Tonight, the barriers looked pointless. Bodies leaned over them, cameras already raised, each person trying to shove the other aside for one perfect shot. Security was thinner than it should have been, distracted by a commotion near the entrance. Sandra felt the first twinge of unease crawl up her spine, but she pushed it down. She was a professional. This was her life. They started walking anyway. The carpet beneath her heels seemed narrower, her dress suddenly heavier. Flashes exploded in rapid bursts, and the crowd, smelling adrenaline and opportunity, surged forward. Someone shouted her name, another yelled his, and then it all melted into a single roar. A camera clipped her shoulder hard enough to sting. She stumbled a half step, her smile faltering. In that moment, she realized there were no real faces out there, just glass eyes, blinking white-hot light into her own. For a second, she felt small, not like a movie star, but like prey. Keanu saw it before she did, the shift from excitement to danger. He noticed how the line of security had thinned, how the photographers were no longer respecting the invisible rules. He heard the change in the voices, less playful, more desperate. Fame had taught him to read chaos early, to recognize when a scene could turn ugly in a heartbeat. And then he saw Sandra's hand, the way her fingers tightened around her clutch, just enough to betray that she was no longer comfortable. He didn't think, he moved. He stepped closer to her, body angling forward, his arm instinctively reaching around her shoulders. Another wave of flashes exploded, but now they were much too close. He could see the outlines of fingerprints smudged on camera lenses. Someone pushed from behind, and the crowd pressed in. A microphone jabbed past his chest. Questions flew at them, loud, overlapping, invasive. "Are you too? Is it true that—" "Look here, Sandra," one voice shouted, "give us a smile." But his tone sounded more like a command than a request. She tried, out of habit, to give them that practiced, gracious smile, but her lips wouldn't quite cooperate. The pressure built faster than either of them expected. A man on the left shoved forward, nearly losing his balance, and his camera swung dangerously close to her face. That was the moment Keanu's calm broke, not into anger, but into something sharper, fierce protectiveness. His hands slid up, fingers threading gently but firmly into her hair as he cupped the back of her head, guiding her toward his chest. His other arm stretched out, palm open, as if he could physically hold back the sea. "Hey, back up," he said, voice low but cutting through the noise. It wasn't a movie line, it was a warning. Sandra felt his hand on her head, and the world narrowed to that single point of contact. The lights, the shouting, the crush of bodies, all of it blurred for a heartbeat. She hadn't realized how close she was to panicking until that touch anchored her. Pressed against his side, she could hear his breath, steady but controlled, and the muffled thud of his heart beneath the chaos. It was oddly grounding, almost absurd. One of the most photographed women in the world hiding in plain sight, tucked beneath the arm of a man who was supposed to be just as used to this as she was. But something inside her gave way, some thin wall she had been holding up for years. And she understood, with a quiet, sudden shock, just how exhausted she was from always pretending this was easy. Around them, the frenzy only intensified. The crowd, seeing the tension, smelled a story. Cameras came closer, shutters rapid-firing in jagged bursts. A security guard tried to reach them and was swallowed by the throng. Somewhere, someone yelled for everyone to step back, but the words were drowned in the hunger for the shot, the one frame that might capture fear or tears or a stumble that could be spun into a headline by morning. Keanu tightened his arm, angling his body so he took the brunt of the push. Sandra felt his jaw set against her temple, heard him murmur something she couldn't fully catch, just a low, steady reassurance. "I've got you, just keep walking, don't look up." For the first time in a long time, she did something that frightened her. She let someone else take control. She didn't fight the instinct to perform, didn't force herself to smile for the cameras or pretend this was fine. Instead, she allowed herself to lean into him, to hide, even if only for a few steps. And as she did, a thought slipped in quietly, almost guilty, yet impossibly comforting. Maybe she didn't always have to be the strong one, the composed one, the unshakable Hollywood professional. Maybe, just for tonight, she could be human. The carpet was only a few dozen feet long, but in that crush of noise and light, it felt like miles. Each step forward tested the limits of their patience and their calm. Keanu's outstretched hand trembled, not from fear, but from the strain of holding back so much reckless energy without lashing out. He knew one wrong move, a shove too hard, a shouted word, could turn this moment into a scandal splashed across every screen. So he swallowed his anger, let it burn clean inside his chest, and chose something harder: restraint. He chose to protect her not just from the bodies pressing in, but from the stories that could ruin the quiet dignity she'd spent a lifetime building. Then, just as they seemed to be breaking through the worst of it, a sudden shout cut through the din, sharper than the rest, followed by the harsh crack of something heavy hitting the ground right behind them. The crowd lurched again, instinctively tilting toward the commotion. Sandra flinched, her fingers clutching at his jacket. Keanu turned his head just enough to see what had fallen, and what or who was now forcing their way directly toward them, camera still rolling. The man barreling toward them wasn't like the others. The rest of the photographers hid behind their cameras, faces half concealed, movements chaotic but predictable. This one moved with purpose. His shoulder had knocked over a small metal barrier. That was the crash they'd heard, and now he was using the brief confusion to slip through the opening security had failed to cover. His camera hung from his neck, still recording, but his eyes were fixed on Sandra with a look that made her stomach twist. It wasn't admiration, it was entitlement. Keanu saw him change direction, cutting across the other photographers, elbowing through people who were already too close. The man shouted her name, stretching it into something sharp and mocking. "Sandra, look over here, we all know why you're hiding." His words sliced through the air, finding the old scars that lay just beneath her practiced calm. There it was, the threat behind the lens. Not just the invasion of space, but the promise of a story twisted to fit whatever narrative would sell best by morning. He took another step closer, camera swinging forward like a pendulum, and Keanu felt the instinctive surge of anger rise like heat in his chest. For a heartbeat, Sandra considered turning toward the man, giving him the shot he wanted just to end it. That was what she'd been trained to do all these years: control the narrative before someone else did. Smile even if your insides are shaking. Laugh even if the question cuts. If she just gave him one clear photograph, maybe he'd back off. But something held her in place, something stronger than fear and more stubborn than habit. The way he stared at her made her feel less like a person and more like a target, and a quiet voice inside whispered, "This is not okay. You don't have to reward this." Keanu felt her hesitate beside him, felt the slight shift in her weight as if she might break away and face the man alone. Before she could, he stepped in front of her fully, his body now a shield between her and the advancing camera. His hand remained on the back of her head, firm but gentle, fingers spread as if he could block the entire world with that single touch. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. "That's enough," he said, eyes locked on the man. The words came out low level, and all the more dangerous for their calm. Around them, the noise dipped for a split second, like the city itself was taking a breath. The photographer didn't back down. If anything, the defiance in Keanu's stance seemed to fuel him. He pushed closer, lens nearly brushing the actor's arm. "What are you hiding her for?" he demanded, half taunting, half triumphant. "Afraid she'll cry for the camera, afraid we'll see the real her?" Every word landed like a slap. He wasn't just violating their space, he was poking at something he didn't understand, the private griefs and quiet battles that had nothing to do with movies or headlines. Sandra's jaw tightened behind Keanu's shoulder. He couldn't see her face, but he could feel the slight tremor in her body, the way she was fighting herself not to react. Security was finally starting to break through the outer ring of cameras, but they were still several steps away, slowed by the crush of bodies that had converged on the chaos. Someone shouted for the photographers to move back, but the command sounded empty, drowned out by the relentless staccato of shutters clicking. Keanu realized in that instant that help was coming, but not fast enough. For these next few seconds, it was just him, Sandra, and a man who believed her fear was his right to capture. A dozen choices flashed through Keanu's mind in the span of a breath. He could shove the camera away, satisfying for a moment, catastrophic in the headlines. He could walk off and drag Sandra with him, but that would leave the story to be written entirely by those on the other side of the lens. Or he could do something harder, stand his ground without becoming the villain they were waiting for. He thought of all the people who would see whatever image came from this night, not just fans, but the quiet, unseen souls who watched celebrities like mythic figures and measured their own worth against them. What did it mean to be strong here? What did it mean to be kind in a moment that invited cruelty? He took one deliberate step toward the man, closing the distance just enough that the camera could no longer focus properly. The lens, now too close, caught only blurred shapes. Keanu's voice stayed calm, but there was steel underneath it. "You got your pictures," he said. "She's not a trophy, back off." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. Something in his tone suggested a line had been crossed, and that he was no longer just an actor on a carpet, but a man drawing a boundary the world rarely let him draw. Sandra, hidden in the circle of his arm, listened to every word. A strange mix of shame and gratitude knotted in her chest. She hated that she needed protecting. She hated that part of her still believed she should have handled this better, smiled wider, laughed louder, been more bulletproof. But under that shame was an ache of something gentler, a quiet, breaking relief that someone was finally saying out loud what she had been too conditioned to admit, that this wasn't normal, that she was allowed to be more than an image. She swallowed hard, her throat tight, and realized with an almost painful clarity that kindness wasn't always soft. Sometimes, kindness looked like someone standing in front of you when the world refused to see you as human. The photographer scoffed, but his eyes flickered, uncertainty creeping into his bravado. He adjusted his grip on the camera as though considering his next move. The crowd sensed the tension, and the energy shifted, electric and unstable. Other lenses swung toward the confrontation, ready to capture whatever explosion might come next. A shove, a snap, a headline-making outburst. Somewhere behind them, one of the security guards finally broke free of the tangle and started pushing his way directly toward Keanu and Sandra, face set with determination. Keanu felt the shift too, the way the air seemed to tighten, the way all attention funneled into this single, fragile moment. He could hear Sandra's breathing, quick but steadying, could feel her fingers curled into the fabric of his jacket like an anchor. He knew that whatever he did next would echo far beyond this carpet, into living rooms and phones and the quiet corners of people's lives where they watched strangers on screens and decided what courage looked like. His jaw clenched as he drew in a slow breath, meeting the photographer's gaze with a calm that cost him more than anyone could see. Then, just as the security guard reached out to grab the intruder's arm, the photographer jerked his camera up for one last shot, angling it over Keanu's shoulder, desperate to catch Sandra's face in the split second before she disappeared from view. The flash fired at point-blank range, a brutal burst of white that lit up everything, and in that blinding instant, something inside Sandra finally snapped. She had been holding it together for years, through rumors, breakups, losses, and the constant hum of strangers deciding who she was. But that flash, that violent burst of light inches from her face, tore straight through the thin fabric of her composure. Her vision went white, then smeared into colors. Her heart slammed against her ribs, and the noise of the crowd collapsed into a single, piercing hiss in her ears. She wasn't on a red carpet anymore. For a split second, she was back in every moment she'd ever felt hunted. Every time someone had ambushed her outside her home, every time a private pain had been turned into a headline, every time she'd told herself, "Just smile, it will be over soon," and swallowed her own fear. But this time the fear didn't swallow quietly. It rose like a wave she couldn't climb over. Her knees softened, and she felt her body lean harder against Keanu's side, not from choice, but from something close to collapse. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts. She wanted desperately to disappear, to vanish into some quiet place where no one knew her face, where no one cared about the curve of her expression or the shine of her tears. For the first time on a carpet, she didn't worry about how she looked. She worried about whether she could stay standing. Keanu felt the change before he even saw her face. Her weight shifted almost imperceptibly, but to him it was as if the ground had tilted. The hand that had been clutching his jacket tightened, fingers curling into a fist so small and desperate it made his chest ache. He turned his head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of her eyes beneath the curtain of hair he was trying to shield her with. They weren't the composed, witty eyes the world knew. They were wide, raw, and shimmering with something she almost never let anyone see. Panic. Real, unvarnished panic. It hit him hard, not as guilt, not as anger, but as a deep, steady sorrow. This was the cost no one saw when they watched red carpets from their sofas, sipping coffee and scrolling through photos. This was the toll taken by every headline that forgot she was a person first, an image second. He'd seen glimpses of it before in quiet conversations and half-finished sentences, but never this naked, this close. For a fraction of a second, he thought about dragging her back to the car, abandoning the whole event, consequences be damned. Then he realized something important. Running would only turn this moment into a spectacle. Staying, on their own terms, might give it a different meaning. The security guard finally reached the aggressive photographer, grabbing his arm with a grip that was more than just professional. You could hear the frustration in it, the weight of too many nights like this. The man protested, half outraged, half gleeful, already spinning the narrative in his head. I was just doing my job. Cameras swung wildly, trying to catch every angle. Some caught the guard's stern expression, others the photographer's theatrical resistance. For a few seconds, the attention shifted away from Sandra and Keanu, like a storm cloud being nudged by a different wind. In that brief opening, Keanu turned fully toward her. He lowered his arm just enough to see her face, really see it. The mask was gone. Her eyes were glassy, her lips parted as she fought for control of her breathing. Her usual quick wit, the jokes she used to keep herself and everyone else comfortable, were nowhere to be found. She was just tired, breakably, profoundly tired. The sight pierced through every layer of his carefully managed calm. He leaned closer, so close that his words were for her alone, unheard by the microphones hovering just out of frame. "Hey," he murmured, his voice softer than anyone in that crowd would ever believe. "Look at me, not them." It took a second, but her eyes found his. He held her gaze like a lifeline, his own expression steady, unhurried. "Breathe with me, okay? In, out, that's it. We're almost through this." He wasn't promising that the world would suddenly be kind. He wasn't promising that the headlines wouldn't twist. He was only promising one small, honest thing, that she wouldn't have to face this particular moment alone. Sandra swallowed, her throat tight, and dragged in a breath that felt like lifting a weight. The air tasted like metal and perfume and heat from too many bodies, but somehow it made it into her lungs. She let it out slowly, matching the rhythm of his chest rising and falling against her shoulder. It didn't erase the fear, but it gave it a shape she could live with. There in the middle of the chaos, she made a quiet decision, a rebellion so small it was almost invisible. She would not let this moment define her as weak. Vulnerable, yes. Shaken, absolutely, but not broken. "You want to go?" he asked, the question simple but loaded. It wasn't the kind of question Hollywood usually asked a woman on a carpet. It wasn't, "Can you keep going?" Or "Are you okay to smile?" It was permission to choose something other than performance. For a long second, she didn't answer. Her mind raced through the possibilities, leaving and becoming a story of fragility, staying and risking more pain, retreating into old habits of pretending nothing touched her. She hated all of them. Then another possibility appeared, fragile but real. One where she stayed, not because she owed anyone a show, but because she refused to let fear be the last word. She shook her head just once, barely more than a tremor. "No," she whispered. "I want to walk in, but not like this." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she hated that, but he didn't flinch. If anything, his grip on her shoulder grew a fraction warmer. There was no admiration in his eyes, no cinematic awe at her courage. There was something better, simple, unwavering respect. The security team began to regain control, pushing the crowd back inch by inch, restoring the boundaries that should have been there from the start. The aggressive photographer was being led away, still half shouting about rights and freedom of the press, but his voice was already fading into the general roar. Other cameras tried to capture Sandra's face, hungry for tears, for visible cracks. They wanted the image of a broken star, a damsel in distress held up by a chivalrous hero. It would have been an easy narrative, one that sold well, one that required no thought. Keanu refused to give them that script. He didn't straighten up for a heroic pose. He didn't look around with a fierce, cinematic glare. Instead, he did something that would probably never make it into the most clicked photos. He lowered his forehead for a second, almost touching hers as if they were two ordinary people hiding in a crowded subway station. "One step at a time," he said quietly. "We'll write our own way through this." ready. He waited, not for the crowd, not for the cameras, but for her. Sandra closed her eyes for just a moment, gathering herself from the scattered pieces this night had tried to break apart. She thought about every time she'd told younger actors to protect their boundaries, to remember they were more than the stories told about them. She realized with a humbling jolt that she hadn't always followed her own advice. Kindness, she suddenly understood, had to start close, in the way she spoke to herself, in the way she allowed herself to be held when the world became too loud. When she opened her eyes again, they were still wet but clearer. She gave the smallest nod. "Ready," she said, though her voice didn't sound like the polished version people knew. It sounded like a woman who had been knocked off balance and was choosing to stand anyway. Keanu straightened slowly, still keeping her tucked against his side, but not hiding her completely now. Together, they turned toward the entrance of the theater, the glow of its lights promising a different kind of quiet inside. They took a step forward, then another. The cameras followed, but the energy had shifted, less triumphant, more uncertain. This wasn't the story they'd come for. There was no meltdown, no shouting match, no perfectly framed shot of a star crumbling under pressure. There was just a woman, visibly shaken, walking forward with a man who refused to trade her dignity for a dramatic moment. Each step felt like a small act of rebellion against a world that fed on spectacle. And just as they reached the halfway point to the doors, close enough to see the reflection of their own distorted shapes in the glass, Sandra caught sight of something unexpected at the edge of the crowd. A young girl, maybe 18, pressed against the barrier, no camera in her hands, only a crumpled movie ticket and eyes wide with a very different kind of intensity. The girl's gaze met hers, and in that split second before a security guard guided them onward, the girl did something that stopped Sandra's breath in her chest. She lifted her hand, not to wave, not to take a picture, but to press it gently against her own heart, as if to say, "I see you." She didn't know why that one small gesture hit harder than all the shouting, but it did. That girl's hand over her heart, no words, no phone, no demand, cut straight through the fog of panic and exhaustion. Sandra's steps slowed for half a second, just enough to really look at her. The girl's eyes weren't hungry, they were worried. Not for the image, not for the headline, for her. In that fragile instant, Sandra saw something she hadn't let herself believe in for a long time. That beyond the noise and the flashes, some people still cared about the human being behind the name. The glass doors of the theater loomed just ahead, promising mercy from the chaos. Another security guard reached for the handle, ready to swing it open, ready to swallow them into the dark, quiet interior. But Sandra hesitated. Her heart was still racing, her hands still trembling, yet something had shifted inside her. She was tired of being a silent canvas for other people's stories, tired of pretending this was normal, tired of letting fear write the last line. She realized that if she walked through those doors without lifting her head, this night would stay lodged in her memory as one more moment where she'd survived, but not really lived. She stopped just long enough that Keanu felt the pause and glanced down at her. "You okay?" he asked softly, the words simple, not performative. The crowd was still buzzing, the cameras still clicking, but their little bubble of stillness felt strangely solid, almost sacred. She took a breath that went deeper than the ones before, grounded by the warmth of his hand at her back and the image of that girl at the barrier who had reminded her she wasn't alone. "I don't want to go in as a ghost," she said quietly, surprising herself with the honesty of it. "I don't want them to remember this as the night I hid." The admission stung, but once spoken, it loosened something in her chest. Keanu studied her face, really looked, and nodded once, a small, steady motion that told her he understood far more than she'd said aloud. "What do you need?" he asked. The question was so rare it almost unmoored her. Not "what should we do?" Not "what do they expect?" Just "what do you need?" For a woman who had spent so many years anticipating everyone else's comfort, the invitation to answer for herself felt both terrifying and liberating. She glanced back over her shoulder toward the sea of cameras and faces. The aggressive photographer was gone, but dozens remained, waiting. She could feel their curiosity, their impatience, their hunger for a story. "I need to stand up," she murmured, "on my own feet, but not alone." The contradiction made her blush, but she didn't pull the words back. She was allowed to be complicated. She was allowed to be both strong and supported. A faint, crooked smile touched Keanu's mouth, not the one he used for premieres, but the one reserved for private jokes and quiet truths. "We can do that," he said. He didn't step away from her, didn't drop his arm. Instead, he shifted his stance, no longer sheltering her completely but standing beside her, shoulder to shoulder. His presence was still a shield, but now it was a visible choice rather than a hiding place. They turned back toward the crowd together. The noise swelled, flashes sparking like distant lightning. For a moment, Sandra almost flinched, but then she remembered the girl at the barrier, the hand over the heart. She remembered every message from people who had told her that watching her on screen had helped them through their own storms. She thought of the younger version of herself, the one who had come to this town with two big dreams and no understanding of what they would cost. That girl had wanted fame. This woman wanted something quieter, deeper, to be real. She straightened her spine, lifting her chin just enough to meet the lenses head-on. Her eyes were still a little red, her expression unpolished. She didn't force a megawatt smile. She let the emotion sit there, visible and imperfect. Instead of posing, she simply stood, one hand resting loosely at her side, the other brushing Keanu's arm as if to anchor herself. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't orchestrated, but it was honest. The photographers, thrown off script, hesitated for a fraction of a second, unsure how to capture this. Then the shutters began again, but something in the rhythm had changed. They weren't getting the meltdown they'd hoped for, nor the flawless, impenetrable star they were used to. They were getting a woman who had clearly been shaken and was still choosing to remain present. The image didn't fit neatly into one headline. It required nuance. And nuance, in a world addicted to extremes, was quietly radical. Keanu didn't look at the cameras. He looked only at her, watching the small battle playing out in the set of her shoulders, the way her breath steadied bit by bit. "You're doing great," he murmured, not as flattery but as a factual report. She huffed out a short, almost disbelieving laugh, the sound raw but real. "Feels like I'm barely holding it together," she said under her breath. "Sometimes that is holding it together," he replied. "Sometimes that's the bravest version." She let his words sink in. All her life, bravery had been framed as big gestures, taking difficult roles, speaking out publicly, keeping working when life fell apart behind closed doors. No one had ever framed it as staying soft when the world tried to harden you. No one had told her that allowing herself to lean just a little and then deciding to stand counted as courage. They didn't stay out there long. A publicist appeared beside them, her voice low and urgent, asking if they wanted to skip interviews, offering an alternate entrance. For once, Sandra said yes without feeling guilty. She had nothing to prove tonight. The act of standing there, visible in her shaken but unbroken state, felt like enough, more than enough. As they finally stepped through the glass doors and into the hush of the theater lobby, the sound changed instantly. The roar of the crowd outside muffled into a distant echo. The air was cooler, dimmer, lined with soft gold light and the scent of popcorn. It was like surfacing from deep water. Sandra exhaled slowly, feeling the tremor in her own body lessen inch by inch. They kept walking until they reached a quiet corner near a velvet rope, where only a few staff members moved about their tasks, respectful enough to avert their eyes. There at last, Keanu let his arm drop from her shoulders, giving her space without stepping away. He searched her face again, not for performance, but for truth. "You all right?" he asked. She took inventory, the lingering shake in her hands, the dull throb behind her eyes, the tightness in her chest that was gradually loosening. And beneath it all, a strange, steady warmth, humility maybe, or gratitude. "I will be," she said. This time, the words didn't feel like a line she'd rehearsed for talk shows. They felt earned. "Thank you for not making a scene out there, for not turning this into some heroic moment." He shrugged lightly, the gesture as unassuming as the man himself. "You didn't need a hero," he said. "You just needed a friend who knew when to step in and when to step back." The simplicity of it undid her more than any dramatic gesture could have. In a world that constantly pushed them towards spectacle, he had chosen restraint. In an industry that rewarded ego, he had chosen humility. And in a moment when he could have centered himself in the story, he had chosen, quietly and deliberately, to center her humanity instead. Later that night, as predicted, the photos would flood the internet. Some would show him reaching out, palm extended, shielding her from the crowd. Others would capture her pressed against his chest, eyes closed, vulnerable in a way the world wasn't used to seeing. There would be headlines about chivalry and protection, about their friendship, about the dramatic scene on the carpet. But buried among those images would be a few frames that told a subtler story. Sandra, standing on her own 2 feet beside him, eyes still damp, gaze steady, refusing to hide. Those were the photos that would linger with people, the ones where courage didn't look like a perfect pose, but like a person choosing to stay soft when the world wanted to turn them into stone. Somewhere, that 18-year-old girl would scroll past them, hand unconsciously drifting over her heart again. Somewhere, someone fighting their own unseen battles would see those images and feel a little less alone. And for Sandra, the night would not be remembered as the evening she was swallowed by a paparazzi swarm. It would become something else, a turning point, quiet but real. A moment when kindness looked like a hand on her shoulder, courage looked like staying, humility looked like not cashing in on heroism, and resilience looked like walking forward while still trembling. Standing there in the dim lobby, she glanced at Keanu and felt a small, genuine smile tug at her lips. Not for the cameras this time, but for herself. "You know," she said softly, "if they're going to turn this into a story, I hope they at least get the important part right." "What's that?" he asked. "That sometimes," she said, "the bravest thing you can do isn't facing the crowd alone. It's letting someone stand beside you and choosing not to let fear be the loudest voice in the room." He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded in quiet agreement. No applause, no dramatic soundtrack, just 2 people sharing a truth the world outside rarely stopped long enough to hear. Then together they turned toward the theater doors, ready to step into the dark, not as untouchable stars, but as flawed, resilient humans, still a little shaken, still a little scared, but moving forward anyway.